Hello and welcome to another episode of PsycKicks. My name is Liv, and this is the podcast where we talk about all things metaphysical, spiritual, paranormal, and in between. Today, we're continuing on in our part 2 understanding of chaos, the formless void in which creation itself was philosophically theorized to have arisen from. Now, last week we talked about more of the Greco-Roman understanding of chaos as a mythological figure within the beginnings of the pantheon, because chaos in our subsequent conversations that are yet to come about gods is the thing that came before the gods, at least in the Greek mythological understanding of it. So that is why we started with chaos itself. However, there are cross-reference or parallels that can be drawn between the understanding of chaos in the Greek philosophical sense and lots of other religions, and that's more so what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on how chaos, or the concept of chaos itself, is talked about in other religions. Specifically, we're going to be touching on Babylonian, Egyptian, Chinese, Celtic, Indian, and the Old Testament versions or references to the idea or concept of chaos itself. Because I think it's important to learn that in all of the different cultures and things that have arisen or have come about before us today, like the idea of chaos is something that you can see as a trend throughout all of them. But, you know, one of the things, like, okay, I went to school for science, right? One of the things that bothers me is I feel that I am living in a time where new ideas and things are very hard to discover because so many people before me have existed. So it's like I'm just here to exist within all of the things that other people have already quantified, found, understood, discovered, created, etc., and that there's like nothing new for me to really find out. And I kind of feel like that's something that I felt a little bit while discovering all of these things, or at least researching the concept of chaos within other religions and cultures. But the reason I bring that up is because chaos is used in a lot of different religious and mythological texts in one of two ways. And I'm sure there's a lot more anthropologically speaking or in like a theology sense, but the two that I was able to found, which we're going to reference a lot in today's understandings of things, because again, I'm here to give you guys information, not to tell you what to believe or how to think, but to embolden you or give you the ingredients to create your own thoughts and your own impressions and your own feelings about who came first, God or people. And in that subsequent order of events that have taken place over history and whatever, shape your own spiritual journey, your own ideas and influences that you want to take from, draw positive influences from, etc., or just like shape your ideas. So I think when we go forward with the ideas of learning about gods and deities and their impacts in culture and history, I think it's important, we talked about last week, to apply 3 different words. I think it was aspects, archetypes, and epithets. Now, adding to those 3 words of archetypes, aspects, and epithets, going forward when you're researching and understanding gods and deities, something else that I have found that could be helpful are 2 words: ChaosKampf and Theomachy. Now, when I get into talking about this, you'll understand why I'm talking, or you'll understand why I was mentioning how I feel like nothing ever, like people have already had the same ideas that I've had, but that's okay. We're here to live our own lives and continue on our own quests for knowledge and reflection and importance and whatever else and however we see fit. But other people have had ideas similar to the ones we're going to talk about today that you like, you know, I just feel like I've had aha moments, but other people have had these aha moments too. I guess that's what I'm talking about. Before we get into the mention of chaos in Babylonian, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, Celtic, and Old Testament verses and like mythologies, stories, if you will, let's talk about the general ideas of chaoskampfs and theomachy or theomachism. So chaos is mentioned in other religions, and a reflection of human fears can be seen mentioned in two ways. One is as a ChaosKampf and one as a Theomachy. So in general, Theomachy is a term for a divine battle, while a ChaosKampf is a specific term used for a type of Theomachy involving a cosmic battle with chaotic forces. And a ChaosKampf usually results in a cosmogony, or the development of the universe itself, i.e. chaos, because chaos in the Greco-Roman sense was a cosmogony. It was the creation of the universe. Now, just to sort of solidify that idea as we move forward, a ChaosKampf is a specific type of Theomachy involving a cosmic battle between chaotic forces, often in the context of creation. So there will be like a hero god who defeats a chaotic power, usually associated with the sea or a serpent, that then goes on to create the world or the universe as we know it. And specifically speaking, ChaosKampf is the German word that can be literally translated into a struggle with chaos, and was coined by a man named Hermann Gunkel in 1895 in his book Schöpfung und Chaos and Urzeit und Endzeit. All right, so we're going to talk about a lot of different, just like samples of religious and cultural and mythological works, if you will, just little tiny snippets. So if you want to get all of the information or more information, more in-depth information, if you will, like a whole meal of knowledge, there will be a large list of sources down in the show notes or in the description below if you're listening on the PsycKicks Extras YouTube channel. I want to tell you that now in case all of you are like, we need more. I need more information on this deity or this specific like creation story from this religion or this part of the world. If you want that, let me know in the comments below, or you can go on your own little tirade or rabbit hole of information by using the sources that I have, because there's a quite a variety of sources that I was just like rabbit hole reading. So if you get excited about this stuff like I do, I just want you to know now, it will be down in the show notes. So let's start out with our first understanding of a ChaosKampf that was given in Babylonian or Mesopotamian culture. So there is this book called the Enuma Elish, and it's an ancient Near Eastern text where the goddess Tiamat is defeated by the storm god Marduk. So this is a ChaosKampf, right? So when we're talking about ChaosKampfs, again, a ChaosKampf is like a fight between a quote unquote deity of good and then a deity of chaos or evil or just entropy, if you will. And in this story, Tiamat is a goddess and she's seen as the antagonist of the story, where Marduk is the guy that comes in and like kills Tiamat and ends up creating existence. So in the story, Marduk incapacitates Tiamat with his evil wind and then kills her with an arrow. He splits her in two, creating heaven and earth from her body, and the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers from her eyes, mist from her saliva, and the mountains from her breasts, etc. And then he becomes the ruler of Babylon. And then he also creates people. Well, so Tiamat was a goddess who was around at the same time or before Marduk. There's like a lot of goddess and god drama that goes down, as lots of mythologies have. And there weren't people yet. There were just gods. So after Marduk defeats Tiamat in her rage, where she tries to just like kill everybody. Go read the story. I have a source down below. It's wild. But he then creates people. So it's just interesting how from her, earth and the heavens were born, and then from him, people were created. One of the things I do want to point out, just since we're drawing parallels between religions, between creation stories, using the concept of chaos, the Enuma Elish, aka the 7 tablets of creation, was written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets and recited in Babylon on New Year's Day. And the epic of Enuma Elish is considered one of the oldest stories in the world and can be said to have greatly influenced the religions and stories that followed. which I just think is interesting. Because if we're talking about like the 7 tablets of creation, wasn't it said that in like the Bible, God created the world in 7 days? Anyways, just things I think about while researching things. So this will be, I think, the 3rd or 4th source listed down in the show notes if you want to actually read the 7 tablets completely translated. All right, we're going to move on to Egyptian entities or examples of chaos. So first we have Isfet. Isfet is a primordial deity, very similar to Chaos, because Chaos is listed as a primordial deity that is neither masculine nor feminine. And the name means injustice, chaos, or violence. Isfet is the opposite of Mat, and sometimes Mat is pronounced as Marat in Egyptian, depending on where you're reading or who you're talking to. And Marat is the goddess of order, truth, balance, and justice. So Isfet is the opposing force of Mat. Now, another god in the Egyptian pantheon is Apep, who is the god of chaos and who took the form of a great snake and is the direct enemy of the sun god Ra, which I think is really, really cool. And also the polar opposite of Mat. So we have Isfet, the primordial deity of chaos and violence. And then we also have Apep. So Apep is like not necessarily the primordial deity, but is specifically the deity of chaos that is said to have taken the form of a great snake. Now, when we're talking about chaos, one of the things, aside from the ability to see, because humans really like to see patterns, right? And that's what we're talking about when I share the idea of a Theomachy versus a ChaosKampf. Theomachy and ChaosKampf are 2 sort of patterns that we've been able to understand from learning about other religions and mythologies, cultures of creation, myths, etc. Now, the other sort of pattern, if you will, is a fight between good and evil, chaos and order, balance and justice and injustice, etc. And then also, since we kind of talked about it in ChaosKampfs, the scary, the opposing chaotic deity, usually in Theomachys and ChaosKampfs, comes from the sea or water or the depths of the ocean, and or is a snake or serpent, which is just, I think it's interesting to see how in every culture that we go through, starting with Babylonian or Mesopotamian, which is like the first cultures to have a written language, i.e. cuneiforms, and then moving on to Egyptians who have hieroglyphs, and then the Chinese and everything else. It's just cool to see the similarities drawn between all of the chaos or ideas of chaos and creation myths. So when we go back to Apep is a god, not necessarily the primordial deity Isfet, which would be closer to chaos themselves, but Apep, since they are inherently the polar opposite of Ra, who is the sun god, there's a story, specifically a Theomachy, where Apep and Ra have this battle, this nightly charade, if you will, of epic proportions. So every night, Ra, the sun god, would descend into the darkness of the underworld to defeat Apep. So Ra would sail his giant ship called a bark down into the underworld after the sun would set, because, you know, he's the sun god, right? So that would be why the sun is setting, because Ra is descending into the underworld to defeat Apep. Now, Apep is this giant snake, and I guess since he is the god of chaos, he always attacks Ra and tries to swallow him and his ship whole, to plunge the world into darkness. But each night, Ra battles Apep and would be aided by other gods and goddesses, and every evening he would defeat the evil serpent, which I just think is really freaking cool, right? Now, the caveat to this is that Seth, or Set, another one of the Greek deities, was very notable in all of the different renditions of the battles between Apep and Ra that would happen. Set was one of the gods that most often aided Ra when he would battle the serpent Apep. So Set is the god of chaos, destruction, confusion, evil, anger, and storms. And he was feared by most gods and men, but also revered because he was seen as the savior of the solar bark of Ra, which I I think is interesting because so we have Apep, who is the god of chaos. And then we have Ra, who is the god of the sun. But then you also have Set, who helps Ra. And Set is specifically a god of chaos and destruction and confusion and evil. And it's almost like if one bad thing, i.e., Set, is going to help Ra, the sun god, it's almost like this use of negativity or chaos. Maybe not negativity, but just like this opposing force that helps good is what helps solidify good in and of itself. I don't know. It's odd because I started to notice this trend too when we get into I think it was the Indian version of chaos, where it's almost like, because chaos comes before gods and deities, right? So chaos is what created the universe or the earth as we know it. And then therefore the gods and deities were created. And it's almost like the gods and the deities that come after chaos are what are able to define the creation that comes from chaos itself. So when we get to the Indian interpretation or references of the idea of chaos, you'll understand more of that. But specifically in this story between Apep and Ra and Set, you can sort of see how Apep is this chaos god and Ra is the sun god who has this nightly battle with Apep in order to bring light back to the world each day. But it's Set, this scary deity that everyone is so like afraid of, that adds his own contribution to Ra in order to defeat Apep. So again, it's like what god or deity that comes after chaos is added to the creation to have a favorable outcome. I don't know. It's interesting to me. So anyways, there is also one other Egyptian mention that I was able to find with the god of Nu. So Nu is the chaotic cosmic ocean that existed before the universe was created, which again sort of flows with in the same idea of chaos in the Greco-Roman understanding. So let's now move on to the Chinese understandings of chaos. So the two words in Chinese culture for the concept of chaos is Luwan and Hundun. So Hundun mythologically is the representation of primordial chaos, and it literally translates into meaning muddled confusion, or the muddled confusion before the universe was born. Now on the other side, Luwan is a character that is used to describe chaos and disorder. And when I mean character, I think it actually is, I don't know necessarily what it is called in Chinese, but like the writing in Chinese, in the Chinese alphabet. No, I remember. It's not an alphabet. Chinese is more like actual words than sounds in each character. So these characters, specifically for Luwan and Hundun, they are used to describe chaos and disorder. So these two figures are used in philosophical discussions in Chinese culture and history to understand the balance between order and chaos. And there's a lot of Chinese philosophy that often views chaos, or Luwan and Hundun, as part of the natural balance between forces like yin and yang, which I thought was really interesting. Like, I think, I could be wrong, don't quote me, because I was looking at Chinese characters as a white woman living in the United States is hard for me to understand. I think it was the character for Luwan. So Luwan, I guess, was originally supposed to, the characters represent or be interpreted as like two hands holding a spool of thread, and on one side, one hand is full of like the tangled knot of thread, and then the other hand guides it out to make it be linear and in line with things, so like order, such as to represent the balance between chaos and order, which I just thought was really cool. So like I said, there's all of the sources down below, and one of the sources sort of talks about the character illustrations to depict that analogy. All right, now we're moving on to Celtic understandings of chaos. So we got the Fomorians, which if you look up the word Fomorians, the first three letters are FOMO. And the only thing I can think about is that the whole reason these mythological creatures or deities were upset is because they had a bad case of FOMO. Get it? Fomorians. Anyways, so in Celtic mythology, the Fomorians were a race that were said to have arisen from the sea or the depths of the underworld, linking them to the unknown and unpredictable aspects of existence. They were told as monstrous, destructive beings, or, i.e., the personification of chaos itself. Their leader, a little bit kind of like the Babylonian sort of tale, where there was Tiamat and Murdoch. The Fomorians, their leader was called Balor, and he was this evil dude with one eye that if you looked upon his evil eye, he killed anyone that was looked upon by it. And I was like, wow, sounds like this dude's not to be messed with, you know? So the Fomorians were often interpreted in Celtic lore as the chaotic aspects of nature, such as storms, blights, and earthquakes. And they are depicted as the antagonists of the more ordered and civilized gods called the Tuat de Danann. So, and that's interesting too, because I was reading something about like a goddess, I think, and I could be wrong because I'd have to go back to my little like sketch down notes of, I think, Tuat de Danann. They have a goddess as their leader, which I think is interesting because in a lot of these sort of chaotic or Theomachy stories, the one that rules over everyone else or like wins is usually masculine, like in the Mesopotamian or Near East interpretation of the Enuma Elish has Marduk as the protagonist, or like not the protagonist. I guess you could look at it from a lot of different ways. One of the sources I was reading talks about the Enuma Elish and how that it's not necessarily a creation story or a ChaosKampf at all. It's more just like how kings rose to, like the concept of a king, quote unquote, rises to be the king of all the gods, etc., instead of a creation story. So, I mean, we're not getting into that aspect of it, but I just think it's interesting that unlike the Enuma Elish, where a male deity rises to power or has, you know, like the one who causes chaos to vanish and brings order to the world, it almost seems like without further involved research that the leader of the Tuat de Danann actually is female. But anyways, I'd have to look back on that. I came across the idea of the Celtic Tuat de Danann, and it's something that I wanted to research in and of itself. So when I found this in my research for chaos, I was like, ooh, maybe this means that I should actually cover them more in depth. So anyways, let's move on to our next subset area of the world in which chaos is talked about in cultural, anthropological, mythological, religious texts, and that is India and their interpretation of chaos. So in the Indian interpretation of chaos, the concept of chaos is most prominently represented by the Asuras, or the demonic beings opposing the devas, aka the gods. So this is just another symbolic telling of the struggle between order and chaos in the universe. However, Asuras are actually, they're most specifically associated with Hindu mythology, but I did read that they are not just demonic beings necessarily, because I think that's like a very Western way to word that. When I looked more into the idea or the concept, the mythology of Asuras, they're actually beings that have both good and bad intentions. Now, we're going back to my little tangent that I talked about earlier, where we touched on the Egyptian culture in mythology of Apep and Ra, where it was like Apep was a quote unquote chaos god, right? But then Ra would try to defeat him every night from having Apep the serpent try to eat him and his sailboat in the underworld, but he would defeat him with the help of Set. So Set was a scary, scary god that everyone feared, right? But he would help Ra defeat Apep. So it was like there was this good energy of Ra, right? And Set would come and aid Ra. And even though Set was seen as this scary, terrifying god, his energy, his chaotic sort of essence, when afforded to Ra, just amplified Ra's good and allowed him to defeat Apep each night, right? So it's almost like in the Indian interpretation of chaos too, with their gods and deities, asuras represent both good and bad intentions, kind of like an unstable particle. If we're going to talk about like science concepts, if you have, say, a water particle that is in a gaseous form, if you add or take away from the energy of that water particle in the air, it's either going to continue to allow it to be a vapor or separate into its more like innate elements, depending on the energy you're putting into that particle or that atom. But if you take away energy, it's going to condense into water. And if you take away more energy or put energy into it in a different way, it's going to condense further into a solid, such as ice. So I like to think of the asuras kind of like unstable particles. So if you add more good into the idea of an asura, kind of like how Set added his own sort of chaotic essence into the good of Ra, he was able to defeat Apep. The same sort of idea applies here. Most specifically, I was able to sort of see this pattern, since we're talking about patterns too, this pattern in a myth called the Samudra Manthan. In this myth is where the Devas and the Asuras churn the cosmic ocean together in order to sort of like, I don't think it was necessarily a creation myth in the sense. I'm not going to lie, I didn't research it to the full extent, but I just thought it was interesting that you have the Devas and the Asuras not necessarily working together, but they both have like, it makes me think when they say that they churn the cosmic ocean together, it's that yin and it's the yang, the good and the bad, the waves crashing against each other to make the sea and movement in and of itself. So I don't know. I think that's kind of interesting. So it's like if you add more of one thing to the asuras, then it will push them towards creating better things. Or if you add negative energy to them, it will in turn churn them into moving energy towards more negative creation or destruction, however you want to view it. Now this one I think is interesting because, right, we're starting with the understanding of chaos because we're talking about gods and deities in order to set the stage for future podcasts to talk about other gods and deities. And this goddess is one that I did not know about, but she came up in my research for the understanding of the concept of chaos in Indian mythology. And her name is Kali or Kali Ma, depending on the story that she's in and the teachings through the mythology. But Kali is a Hindu goddess embodying the powers of creation and destruction. And she protects people against evil by doing what others cannot to protect those that she loves. She transcends good and evil, though. She is one of the most compassionate of the Hindu pantheon, and she puts most of her work or her energy, her existence in freeing humans and fellow gods from what binds them and protecting them from what would harm them. However, she never harms the innocent, and her destruction always allows for rebirth. And I just if you're listening right now, pause it, look up the Hindu goddess Kali or Kali Ma, that's spelled with a K and an I, kind of like California, but I was having a conversation with Amanda when we were in New Orleans, and she was telling me that because people kept asking us where we were from, and people she would tell them oh, I'm from California, and they'd be like, oh, you're from Cali? And she said that anyone that's from California never says that they're from Cali. They always say California. Anyways, that's how you spell Cali. Moving on from my side tangent. If you look up the goddess Kali, I think it's so cool. So she has 4 arms. She looks like a woman, right? Her tongue is usually out for different reasons. but her skin is blue. She wields like a knife or a dagger or a sword or a freaking hatchet, whatever it is that she has in the different like statues of her, and her hands are all bloody. But I think the coolest part, aside from adding to the fact that she has like human heads draped around her body as like a necklace or a sash, I found it interesting specifically, like the thing that stuck out to me most about her visual representation is that her skin is blue. Now, you could correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't know literally anything about Indian mythology or Hindu gods and goddesses, just very, very, very vaguely. I don't think all of them have blue skin. I think they can have different colored skin maybe, or different interpretations, but the fact that her skin was blue really stuck out to me while I was researching this little tidbit of a goddess that's associated with chaos in essence. And I found that interesting, specifically just in what Kali or Kali Ma is supposed to do. Like, she protects people against evil by doing what others cannot to protect those that she loves. So it's like hard decisions. It really is just like justice. I don't know. It is a tidbit of fact about me is that my Mars is in Libra. And if you know anything about astrology, Mars, when it comes to your astrological chart, is the planet that rules your ability to make decisions in forward movement and like action, things like that. Like Mars is Aries, right? But mine is ruled by Libra, and Libra is the scales, like justice. So I don't know. Researching this deity really spoke to my Mars and Libra sort of aspect of like, how do you make the hard decisions about things when you feel like there's always a sense of justice and a way to look at some other situation that could give you perspective or insight into like moving forward with judging things, people, situations, etc. Like who's right, who's wrong, and how do we make that decision? So to have a deity, a goddess like that embodies both destruction and creation, like she never harms the innocent and her destruction allows for rebirth. That just like, I don't know. I thought it was pretty cool. And the fact that her skin is blue, I know that when I researched the chakras, it was like one of the very first videos made for PsycKicks was the chakras. I remember learning that the heart chakra in Indian thought, so in Eastern interpretations, or like where the ideas of chakra originated in India, the heart chakra is actually associated with the color blue because it's supposed to represent the sky, which is limitless and ever expanding. And one of the things that I've learned over the past almost 5 years of doing readings professionally and talking to souls and spirit guides and deities, whatever, just, and I'm not saying deities like I do deity readings. I do not do that. This is just anecdotally that has happened organically through readings. I've learned that being able to understand someone or something, a situation, put yourself in someone else's shoes or see it from their perspective is what allows people to have love, not just for themselves, but for other people. Because love is just such a blanket statement sort of word, in my opinion, where love, I don't think, is an emotion itself. It is an ocean of emotion, since we're talking about things that come from things that people fear that come from the ocean, since that is also seen in these theomachies and chaoskampfs of religious interpretations or mythological stories. So I thought it was interesting that her skin was blue because that really spoke to me in my interpretation of understanding Kali as a goddess, that she deals with understanding, but she also deals with love. But she's a scary, 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 intimidating goddess. And I mean, like, she's got heads hanging around her neck, dudes, with like giant ass swords in her hands. That is terrifying. But I think to have that amount of understanding, to have that sense of justice is like, I don't know. It was kind of cool. So I thought that was an interesting way to interpret chaos from the Indian culture. Now, the last thing that I have to say for chaos ideas or concept in Indian mythology or culture is there's a word called Rata, RTA, and it is just the concept of cosmic order. So in a sense, if something has Rata, then it has order. But if there is no Rata, then there's no order, or there is chaos. So I don't know. I'm sure we could do an entire thing just on that word itself, but those are the ideas of chaos within Indian cultures, just like scraping the surface, if you will. Now let's move on to the last area that I have references in for where the concept of chaos is in or within other religions before we move on to my ideas of like how this plays into people's perceptions of chaos in relation to people's ideas of what they fear, like historically speaking, perhaps, as well as, my friend challenged me to try and channel a soul that understands chaos in the Greco-Roman period in that classical sense, because I haven't talked to souls or spirits on the podcast in a while. And that's for lots of different reasons. But I've been just trying to, I don't know, I guess make the podcast less about me and more about the things that I'm talking about and more about you. And I feel like when I do that, it is like taking away from things. But my friend said that I should try and do that again, just based on the fact that chaos in the Greek classical sense was not a deity that someone actually worshipped. It was just more of like a philosophical idea or entity in which the rest of the deities came forth from. So if someone has not actually, or there wasn't people who worshipped or prayed to chaos in the sense of like how people pray to like Athena or Persephone, whatever it is that you want to say, Hermes, Zeus, they're like, what energy exists from people since chaos supposedly came before them and the deities? Like, did anyone actually exist to worship or think about chaos in a certain sense? And the answer, I believe, is yes, because I think I channeled a soul of a man. So we'll talk about that next. But first, we're talking about the biblical references from the Old Testament of the idea of chaos. So, according to the interwebs, and because this revolves around the Bible, there's a lot of hearsay and people's opinions about it, but the opinions that coincide with the theme or topic of this podcast are the ones that I'm going to share. However, there are other ones, so please feel free to take what I say and then do your own research and make your own interpretations, because again, that's what this podcast is here for. So, biblical Old Testament references, specifically the Old Testament of the Bible, there are two references to the idea of chaos. The first one, I'm just going to talk about in order of like when the books come in sequential order based on the Old Testament itself, is the book of Genesis, specifically verse 1-2. This is where I guess people interpret that the concept of chaos is referred to through the Hebrew term, and I'm sorry if I say this incorrectly, tohu vabohu, which is found in the book of Genesis, as I said. So this tohu vabohu is specifically Hebrew that translates as the formless void or without form and void. And it's used to describe the state of the world before creation. It's essentially mirroring the idea of a chaotic state before the universe was ordered by a divine power. Now, the other book or section of the Old Testament that people like to say there is, like, I think it's a Theomachy. It's not a ChaosKampf. It's a Theomachy. But the Theomachy referenced in the Old Testament is specifically Psalm 74, which is where Baal or Yahweh battle the sea serpent Yam or Leviathan, depending on how you're reading the book or where you're reading it. But creation does not occur, hence why it's a Theomachy. But Yahweh defeats Leviathan during creation, and Leviathan represents the chaotic sea. So again, a serpent that comes from the sea, just like in the Egyptian lore, just like in the Mesopotamian/Babylonian lore. But in verses 12 through 15, Yahweh drives the sea back, crushing Leviathan and exposing his body, allowing Yahweh to establish the seasons and celestial bodies, thus creating order out of chaos. So there's a lot of things that I want to talk about here. Let's first talk about Genesis 1-2, because the opposite, like the opposing side of saying that Genesis 1-2 is a cosmogony, which is the creation of the universe. Some scholars reject the association between this biblical reference as a creation and notions of chaos. So they state that the terms themselves in Genesis 1-2 of, I have lots of notes, of Tahu Vabohu or Tohu Vabohu, they say that semantically they're not related to chaos, because in Genesis the term is used to describe the earth, but in other myths it describes the entire cosmos. So they're like, Genesis 1-2 cannot be related to the idea or concept of chaos, because this Tohu Van Bohu is actually creating just the earth, not the cosmos itself or all of creation. Whereas in the other ones, it's more of a cosmogony. So they're like, this is not a ChaosKampf and it's not a Theomachy. So I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. However, if we go back to Psalm 74, where I'm just going to say Yahweh and Leviathan, where Yahweh defeats Leviathan, it's interesting because in a lot of biblical references, it's more so that God is able to command water, right? And that water is something that people fear. Hence why I think Leviathan is a sea serpent that comes out of the water. Like, we fear as people the water. But water also is intrinsically linked to creation, if you think about it from a scientific aspect. Like the primordial waters of the earth, if you believe in evolution, you know, the primordial waters in which human life or life in itself arose. And then just the fact that God is able to have powers over water, I think is just a very, anthropologically speaking, like a historic thing. Like, people fear yet revere water. So I think it's interesting that God can have, like it says here, Yahweh drives back the sea, crushing Leviathan and exposing his body, allowing Yahweh to establish the seasons and celestial bodies. So I think it was in like Noah. Again, I am not a person that has ever read the Bible, ever. But I saw that Noah, I guess Yahweh or God, crushed everyone else that he had made or that the universe had made, and only left Noah and his family alive. And he's like, hey, you got the task to repopulate the world. There you go. Here's your ark. So I think it's interesting that when creation is being talked about or referenced in that sort of situation, it's God who controls the water to sort of extinguish the first creation, but then allows the second creation to move forward. I don't really know what I'm getting at there. I just thought that was interesting, that he has the power to control what people fear, specifically water. So anyways, the last thing I wanted to talk about in relation to this sort of information was that Yahweh uses the body of Leviathan, or the fact that he has crushed this serpent sea monster, to establish the seasons and celestial bodies, thus creating order out of chaos. I find that interesting because I remember being asked who I thought Leviathan was, because again, I don't know anything about the Bible. So I didn't know, when I was asked, like, what is your interpretation as a medium of Leviathan, not having any sort of preconceived understanding of them. I saw this sort of serpent-y thing that was eating its tail. And I was like, I don't know, does that have to do with like time or something like that? So I've always sort of equated Leviathan to what I now understand as the Ouroboros, which is Greek. But when I read the last sentence, that Yahweh established the seasons and celestial bodies after crushing Leviathan, what do we use to understand time and like the passage of time? The planets and the seasons. So it's almost like allowing Yahweh to create seasons and celestial bodies. It's almost like a way to interpret that he had created time and organized it. Because if you think about from a medium standpoint, when we no longer exist within physicality, right? And our soul exists in heaven, spirit, whatever you want to call it. Our soul now exists outside of time. And it's sometimes a hard concept for people to try and, if you can't understand it, just sort of accept, because it's been hard for me to sort of wrap my head around it too. And some days I don't feel like I understand it fully either, which I don't think I ever really will. But to exist outside of time is a weird concept to think about. And time and the perception of time is a very physically intrinsic thing. So I think time is something that people are scared of. So when it says Yahweh established seasons in celestial bodies, thus creating order out of chaos, I think it's interesting that to be without or outside of the stream of time or the concept or conceptualization of time could be something that scares people, or would think like you could equate living outside of time as fearful. I don't know. These are just the things that I was thinking about. I don't really have like a tying in thought. It's just thoughts that I had. They don't really have an end point. Hence Leviathan. So those are the references to the idea of chaos that I have been able to give to you. I tried to give them to you in like sequential order, like anthropologically speaking, of like what civilization came first, or at least like, yeah, kind of like that. Because, you know, Mesopotamians came first, the Egyptians, the Chinese, and then the Celtic, and then the Indian. But I know the last three kind of are there a little bit all at the same time. I just wanted to make sure that I started with the Mesopotamian/Babylonian. But anyways, let's talk a little bit about human fears and chaos. So if we think about chaos in a more philosophical/scientific idea, let's talk about it in a scientific idea. The conception of chaos can be more quantified in a scientific way, or under a word called entropy. And entropy, I'm going to give you the scientific definition because I never want to dumb anything down for anybody. So when I use big things like the scientific understanding or definition of entropy, I don't do it to be a know-it-all. I do it to share how I want other people to share things with me. Anyways, entropy and human fears. Entropy is a thermodynamic quality representing the unavailability of a system's thermal energy conversion into mechanical work, often interpreted as the degree of disorder or randomness in a system. So entropy is a lack of order or predictability, or a gradual decline of something from order into disorder. Like when we are born, right? We are babies, we live, and then slowly with time, our body starts to go into a state of disorder, entropy. More energy is being lost and disorganized than it's being used to harness and allow us to continue to live. So entropy, like that. Or when you walk into your house and your toddler completely ruins everything after you put everything back. Disorder, entropy. So I think that humans, when we sort of go back and look at all of these religious texts and interpretations and mythologies and cultural understandings of the concept of chaos, you can see that there's a lot of things that people are afraid of. Water, the sea, serpents, and things that we're not able to control. I don't necessarily want to say chaos, but I just want to say things that we're not able to control. Disorder, things that we can't organize, which makes sense because if you're thinking about it from an evolutionary standpoint, you always want to be able to be aware of your surroundings and able to control the outcome to the best of your ability as a survival tactic. Because like, if you can predict the movements of a predator or prey, then therefore your ability to survive, your fitness maybe will be more And your fitness is not your ability to survive in a biological sense. When I refer to fitness in the scientific understanding or definition is the ability to survive and reproduce and how much offspring you can have. But that would play, your ability to understand and organize things within your surroundings it would intrinsically act upon your fitness as an organism. So I think it's interesting how people take these fears and add them into their mythologies or understandings of chaos themselves. Now, especially with time, people are so scared of time all the time. I'm running out of time. I have too much time. I'm bored. Like, what is time? If you're getting really into it, just everything about time, I think, draws people in, but also expels them out. Like, and then people's fear of water. Have you seen the memes on the internet where people talk about how we know more about space and more people have been like in space and understanding that than we do our own oceans? Exactly. You think it's because all of the biblical and mythological things talk about how water's scary and like serpents like Leviathan are going to come out and try and eat you? Maybe that's why we're all too afraid to go into the ocean. I don't know. This is just things I think about. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about was the man that I feel that I perceived as a medium when it comes to the Greco-Roman classical understanding of chaos that my friend so graciously had infiltrate my thoughts with. Oh, I don't know. How do I want to start this? Chaos is, what did we learn about chaos from this podcast? Chaos is scary. It is something that can both be feared but also revered, because from this disorganization, this inability to know what's happening and organize it and sort of have all your ducks in the row, but all the ducks are just swirling around you and being thrown out the window or thrown out at you, if you will. That can be very scary and it can be very overwhelming, but it also leads to new beginnings, like Kali Ma. So in the classical sense of chaos, being an entity that wasn't necessarily worshipped, but just understood to have created everything else out of it, I think that I perceived the soul of a man. And it might just be a sort of spiritual thing or encounter that was given to me. But this man stepped forward. So maybe it's more of like a spirit guide vision than me talking to a soul. I'm not entirely sure. There is no answer. I'm just sharing my experience with you. I saw a man who looked like a hermit. So like long white hair, long white beard, sort of a little on the emaciated looking side. But I assumed, since I was asking who, if anybody in the world, was able to worship chaos, even though it's not necessarily something that's been documented within history. This man stepped forward and he told me that when he lived, chaos seemed to have wrecked his life. He lost everything, his wife, his children, his house, his farm, whatever. And he said he didn't know where else to go. And people were like, well, you're just going to be a hermit. So he said he found refuge within like a cave, which again seems extremely ludicrous to think about. But he said that within this hermit sort of stage that he put his life in, he said he sat in the darkness and he asked chaos herself. And this was interesting because my friend was telling me that they interpreted chaos as more masculine energy. But then when they challenged me to see if there was a soul that would step forward to tell me about their experience with chaos as a deity or understanding it as an entity personally, this man stepped forward and referred to chaos as a she. So interesting. So this man said he sat within the darkness and he asked chaos herself, why was havoc wreaked on his life? He said, because I couldn't find any other information necessarily from the gods or deities, and that it's not necessarily that he couldn't find information from the rest of the pantheon of the Greek or Roman gods and deities. It's that he didn't believe that they were there to help him anymore. Like what gods and deities would let ruin just lay waste to his life? So he said, I wanted to know chaos herself, why she would have done something like this, because it could only be chaos that caused the destruction of his life. And he said that within the darkness, he found that chaos does create things. It's just, in order for things to come about, there has to be a destruction. And I just thought that was interesting. And he says, it's interesting on how you can see the end of something, or the destruction, or the chaos amongst something that's happening in your life. You can either see it as the end to something, or you can see it as like you can see it as chaos, or you can see it as the building blocks or the tools and resources to build something anew. And he said chaos gave him the information to understand that he may have all of these pieces, but he still has the parts to build what he needs for the future. And I just thought that was interesting. So whether it's real or not, or like whether it was a soul of a man I was speaking to, or my spirit guides that were sort of conveying a mental imagery to answer the question I asked, it doesn't matter. I thought it was pretty freaking cool. So I hope you guys enjoyed this Sunday's podcast. And I know it was kind of a long one. That's also why I didn't talk about a life update. I don't really have anything new in my life right now, except for the fact that I literally burned the absolute crap out of my finger. Like my finger almost melted to this hot spot in the inside of my dishwasher because I was trying to see why my dishwasher wasn't working. And I touched something that I thought would be like a hose that water comes out of, but it was actually the thing that gets really, really hot to sanitize everything. So other than that, everything's pretty hunky-dory. Thank you so much for listening to this Sunday's podcast. We'll see what is in store for next Sunday, next week. But until next time, peace out, Brussels sprouts.